before getting the flyer for today's event, how many of you had heard about spiritual bypass before? Yay, my two friends in the front row. Yeah, so that really is my mission is to bring this language, not just to people in recovery, but to people generally in the mental health field. I heard about it when I was in graduate school, and I was so surprised that I hadn't heard of it before, because I have come to discover that it is such a pervasive issue. Essentially, spiritual bypass is a defense mechanism where you use your spiritual practice or ideas to avoid your feelings or your experience, right? So if I pray hard enough, if I meditate long enough, if I find the right sponsor, if I do the perfect fourth step, if I go to 90 meetings in 90 days, you name it, yoga, green juice detox, I've done them all, right? I'll sort of transcend the human condition, right? And because it's a defense mechanism, this is not a conscious occurrence. It's not like people are setting out to think that they can actually transcend the human condition. But it's that unconscious thinking behind, or motivation behind doing what you're doing. And so, let me just step back a little bit. John Wellwood actually coined the term in the 70s. And he's a psychotherapist up in the Bay Area and a Buddhist and meditation practitioner. So, and he's written very eloquently on the subject, so I encourage you to check out his writings. But he saw that, in particular, Western practitioners were turning to their meditation practice with this idea that they weren't supposed to still have any of the normal day-to-day struggles, and that they thought that they were doing something wrong in their meditation practice if they were still having to deal with that stuff. And so, in essence, he then coined the term spiritual bypass. And that, he would say, and I would certainly agree, that regardless of the spiritual practice, spirituality is not this top-down, cure-all panacea for whatever ails you, right? It's more of a container to hold you in whatever your circumstances are. But we can have some magical thinking about it being this, golden ticket to all of our problems. So he's the one who coined the term, in the 70s, and then essentially no one said anything about it. And maybe a couple writers were writing about things that were similar. But every paper that I ever wrote became about spiritual bypass. I couldn't stop thinking about it personally. I started seeing it a lot in my clinical work. Talking to more people in recovery in particular, it seemed anybody that I started to talk to about spiritual bypass, they said, I know what you're talking about, right? I've had that experience. Or they could identify that experience in somebody else. And so we kind of had this collective feeling that, why aren't we talking about this? Well, because we don't have the language for it. So that was the reason that I decided to do my dissertation research on spiritual bypass in 12-step recovery specifically. And I interviewed people with 10 or more years of recovery, and just generally really talked about their experience of the intersection between their psychological growth and development and their spiritual practice. And it was so fascinating and so rewarding to get to hear these stories, several of which are highlighted in the book. And the biggest surprise for me, so a little more, personal disclosure, is that when I heard about spiritual bypass, I was looking at it as this, evil that we had to get rid of, this horrible thing that was corrupting people's spiritual paths and their recovery, and, how do we spot it and get rid of it? So it was kind of a bypass in and of itself, right? That I was going to figure out the way. And what I actually discovered is that, like all defense mechanisms, spiritual bypass has both adaptive and maladaptive qualities. So if we look at the defense mechanism of denial, for example, and if we look at it even in terms of the recovering population, you can see that, and I'm sure you've heard similar stories, that people will come to me and say, Ingrid, honestly, the truth is, if I wasn't in denial about my using, despite all of the negative consequences that it had at the time. There's a period of time where it actually saved my life. Right? If I wasn't drinking or using, I probably would have killed myself. So that is actually an adaptive function of denial. You know, it's a defense mechanism, and sometimes we need a little defending. But there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's the maladaptive side of defense mechanisms. So obviously, in terms of addiction, you know, we all know hundreds of stories of people ending up in jails, institutions, and death, right? That they're not able to break that cycle. So the same is true with spiritual bypass. And because I was interviewing people with long-term recovery who were still sober and still, you know, invested in their path, most of the people that I spoke with really did have these adaptive experiences of bypass. You know, they would say to me that the truth was that if they didn't believe, especially when they first got sober, if they didn't believe that, you know, doing all the things I mentioned, 90 meetings in 90 days, whatever the case was, that was going to